Welcome to the Gentleman's Guide to Vampires. This video is an expose on Clan Salubri. Now, why have I not covered Clan Salubri before now? After all, I covered very many other clans in my other 14 videos. The Gangrel, the Malkavians, the Assamites, even the Cappadocians. And the Cappadocians, like the Salubri, are a dead clan. Perhaps more so in the case of the Cappadocians due to their odd predilections, but why have I not covered the Salubri? Perhaps it is because they are undeserving of coverage. Perhaps such acts should not be chronicled. After all, are they not soul-eaters, diabolarists, the maggots that writhe in the pit of the undead? They consort with demons, say some. Surely the Tremere did us a great favour by exterminating the Salubri, or at least instigating their extermination. Truly, if you went to the Tremere and asked for information on the Salubri, while the Tremere are generally reticent to give out any of their tomes, scrolls or parchments, Tremere will always find time to give you some kind of knowledge, some kind of lore on the crimes of Saulot, or the deviant acts of Clan Salubri. Strange that, but history is written by the victors, and if it can be said that the Tremere and the Salubri had a war and not a purge, the Tremere were certainly victors in that war, at least ostensibly so. But I said, because of the amount of comments and messages that I received about Clan Salubri wanting a video dedicated to them, that I would approach them in an unbiased tongue, and this is what I intend to do. This clan originated, of course, along with the rest of the major clans, around the time of Cain and the second generation. Saulot, supposedly, according to some, being a member of the third generation, an antediluvian like every other clan founder, or maybe even a member of the second generation, and a child of Cain himself. Now, it depends who you believe. The Ventru claim that Vedartha was favoured by Cain. The Assamites claim the same for Hakim, the Salubri claim the same for Saulot. Maybe Cain was just a bit mercurial, but the point is, and the perhaps truth of it is, that Cain saw something in Saulot as a mortal that reminded him of Abel, his now long murdered brother. And perhaps it was his innocence, perhaps it was his naivety or his inquisitiveness, but something about Saulot reminded Cain of Abel. It made something awaken in him that he had forgotten that he ever had, perhaps a flicker of humanity. And so either he embraced Saulot or he arranged for one of his children to embrace Saulot. But Saulot was embraced, and unlike many other vampires, somehow became accustomed to his undead state very, very quickly. While he was no doubt racked with guilt and pain and anguish that he was no longer one of the mortals whom he loved, he quickly adapted. Now, you could take this as good or ill, and certainly, again, it depends on who you ask. Perhaps he was so harmonised within himself, perhaps he was so enlightened that he realised that it did not matter what physical state he was in, his soul was still pure. Or perhaps he was already such a monster, so gifted with concealment of his true intent, that he had always intended to be embraced, that he had always intended to gain more power, and that by playing on Cain's nostalgia, on his weakness, his love for his brother, he arranged for this great power to be bestowed upon him. But again, it depends on your perspective. Saulot was something of a pilgrim, a great traveller, more so perhaps than any of the other antediluvians. While certainly in the company of Malkav, he soothed Malkav's tortured, madnesses. Malkav supposedly interpreted many of Saulot's dreams and portents, and Saulot was gifted with great oracular foresight. Indeed, he travelled to the east and to the land of the Quajin, the kindred of the east, where he spent many a century, eventually returning with a third eye painted onto his forehead that quickly became real. Now, depending again on the interpretation of what you've been told, some say that the Quajin gave this to him as a gift because of his great foresight, and that this third eye would allow him to peer into the souls of mortals and immortals alike. It would allow him to see the spirit world and the astral plane. Others say that it was a curse, it was a warning to all that saw Saulot that he was unnatural, that he was a monster, an aberration. For some reason the name stuck that Saulot was Saulot the liar from the east. Now what did he lie about? He travelled south to the Dark Continent, the Ebony Kingdom, Africa, where he spawned another bloodline, the Nkulu-Zau, who are perhaps more reviled than any other bloodline of any other clan. Even the Naglopers, their neighbours in Africa, are less feared perhaps than the Nkulu-Zau, soul eaters to a vampire. Rampant diabolarists, worse than the Assamites. But it is in Europe where the Salubri themselves are known most, or were. Healers, counsellors, princes. The Salubri were one of the high clans of the Dark Ages and before. Rome was built on the Salubri. There were Salubri in Jerusalem. There were Salubri in Constantinople. There were Salubri in every major city of influence, because the Salubri were a tremendous boon to every vampire that had one in their council. The Salubri were so in touch with their humanity and mortals and religion that they provide this vital link that other vampires just seem to lose. The Salubri, perhaps because of their great links to religion, and specifically Christianity after its establishment, became known for their great ability to succeed where other vampires failed on the path to Golconda. Golconda is the mystical state of enlightenment that vampires sometimes try to attain, that will allow them to no longer have the pangs of hunger that other vampires do, that would prevent them from being afraid of fire and the sun, that would allow them to stave off their beast once and for all. Now the Salubri will paint this and say to you that that is a state of enlightenment, that it was purity of soul and thought and body, that a Salubri who has achieved Golconda, of which there have supposedly been many, although how this can be measured I cannot say, are the ultimate beings, the ultimate immortals, the wise men that live on pillars in temples in the middle of nowhere, that have achieved Golconda and are at peace with their physical and spiritual being. The Tremere, and even other vampires, followers of Set especially, would tell you Golconda sounds to me like the way to make yourself a perfect predator. No longer afraid of your beast, so you're free to act with impunity. No longer afraid of the sun, so that means you can walk around in daylight and strike at your enemies while they sleep. You don't need to feed as much, so you are no longer racked with the sins of your forefathers, but free to commit your own with, again, impunity. You can become a shark, a predator, if you have reached Golconda, without any fear of loss of grace, because once you are there, you are stuck there, or so say other clans, detractors of the Salubri's aims. And certainly that is the aim of the Salubri healer. The Salubri are divided into castes, and the healers have the discipline of Obeah, along with Auspex and Fortitude, Obeah being a healing discipline, something unlike anything any other vampires have. It literally allows them to heal other vampires and mortals alike. Some say that at higher levels it can even bring a mortal back from the dead, or perhaps even turn a vampire mortal once again, although this may just be conjecture. The problem, and the criticism that Obeah often receives, is the cost for using it, not on the part of the Salubri, but on the part of the victim of Obeah. And I say victim, as it is said that to receive the gifts of Obeah, you must lose part of your soul to the person using it. Can you imagine, dear child, being slowly diabolarized? Not in some rampant bloodlust, where a vampire falls upon you and drinks of your heart's blood and soul. No, no. But piece by piece, every single time that healer comes to you and extends your life by another 10 years, he takes another inch of your soul, until eventually he has consumed it all and left you an empty husk, destined to go to hell or spend the rest of your existence in purgatory. Again, is this what Obeah does? Who can say? There are no Salubri around to answer. But yes, the Salubri are divided into castes, and as well as the healer caste, you have the warrior caste, led by a vampire by the name of Samael, one of Saulot's child, and not necessarily one of the obedient ones. Indeed, Samael was known to tug at the leash a bit too much, and Saulot was something of a strict father. You may think of Saulot as the Jesus of Canaanites, a bit of a hippie who lets his child to do what they will, but he had some very strict codes. Never embrace one that you love. Never, ever, ever embrace a child, because they have not yet lived, and it is a great sin to trap an elder soul in a child's body. And, of course, the martial aspects. Now, Samael was a warrior. He was a temperamental warrior, and he was schooled by great Bruja philosopher kings. He founded his own bloodline, finally snapping free of the healer yoke, and the warrior caste that Samael forged were the greatest force that the Bali ever had to face. Now the Bali we will cover in another video, but needless to say they are some of the most depraved, disgusting vampires that have ever existed. It is rare that anything can unify all vampire clans against one enemy except for the Bali. And Samael, along with many other vampires of clans Bruja, Assamite, Gangrel, led wars against the Bali that nearly drove them into extinction, and perhaps without the actions of Samael and the warrior caste, and this indeed reduced the warrior caste by great degrees, perhaps saved many of the vampires of the Long Night from the corruption of the Bali, for they are so few now. But alas, Samael was betrayed. None can say who by. But it is worried by any surviving Salubri that it is still one of the surviving Salubri that betrayed Samael to the Bali after all, and perhaps it is the same Salubri that betrayed them to the Tremere later on. You may be wondering why is it that the Salubri have such stigma against them, but in a race of killers, of predators, when one comes bearing gifts, you always wonder what's concealed in the other hand. Look at the followers of Set. They offer much, but they take a lot. At least they're quite obvious about it. What are the Salubri taking from you? Perhaps it is a moot point, for early in the 11th century AD, Saulot in Torpor was found by fledgling vampires of a bloodline known as the Tremere, a bloodline of Clan Zemisi. Again, how the Tremere found Saulot is unknown, but it is said that Tremere himself, along with Goratrix, Etrius, and a number of his childer, fell upon the antediluvian while he slept and diablerized him, and Saulot put up no struggle whatsoever. What it is known from Etrius, the favoured child of Tremere, is that just before Saulot turned to ash, he smiled and the third eye on his forehead opened. What effect has this had on Tremere himself? Well, conflicting reports state that Tremere achieved another sense of enlightenment all by himself, or that he developed a third eye, or that his limbs have dropped off and that he has become a Chthonian, and that Saulot lives within his body. Perhaps the powers of Saulot are not so wise and pacifistic. Perhaps they are a lot more malevolent than other vampires perhaps presumed. The thing is, the purge against the Salubri, at first the vampires of Europe laughed at the ideas of the Tremere. They should indulge in this purge. Indeed, the Gangrel, the Malkavians, the Nosferatu, and the Zemisi saw this as a grand excuse to fall upon the Tremere, wipe them out. They have taken the heart's blood of one of the original clans, one of the high clans at that. A clan that had always healed and helped and stabilised the vampires of the Long Night. But then the rumours started, Rumours that had always been around, but the Tremere just helped fan the flames of. That the Salubri were stealing souls, that they were stealing power, that they were undermining princes, and you know how paranoid vampires can get. It becomes very difficult when the Cappadocian that your Salubri has been friends with for many, many centuries decides the Tremere have a number of occult tomes that would really help with my research. This Salubri may well be a diabolist. Who am I to judge? If I turn him over to the Tremere, I could be doing the kindred in general, Cainites in general, a favour, and I will also be getting tomes out of the bargain. The Ventru, who had always been stalwart allies of the Salubri, fell on honour at first and said, it would impugn our honour to throw the Salubri to the wolves. But then they realised, or then they at least started to think, the Tremere would make better allies, stronger allies, against the Tzimisce and the other Cainites of the East than the Salubri ever had. After all, the warrior caste was completely dilapidated during the Barley Wars, so what good would a bunch of healers be at that point? Pragmatism won out. The Tremere were a more vital asset. The rumours were believed very, very quickly indeed, and Salubri can only feed off of willing victims. So when the Tremere started spreading rumours among the mortal populaces of where Salubri resided about these devil-worshipping healers, these people that would take your souls in order to get close to your blood and supposedly heal you, even their chosen prey started to drift away from them. Can you see how difficult it would become for a Salubri? It can perhaps be judged by the fact that the Salubri's allies that had been around for so many centuries, the Salubri were firmly in bed with the Malkavians, but Malkavians betray themselves and therefore quite easily betray the Salubri. The Nosferatu can only do so much, and sewers only extend so far, and the Gangrel would advise the Salubri, seek solitude like we do, but the Salubri are animals that require company. They cannot dwell on their own. They cannot survive like that. The Tzimisce, sharing a mutual enemy in the Tremere, would offer the Salubri counsel and domain back in their own sanctuaries, in their hoary old towers in Eastern Europe, which would work for a time until the Salubri grew disquieted by the screams coming from the cellar. Tzimisce and Salubri philosophy differs greatly. And then, of course, there are the more mercenary clans, the La Sombra, the Toreador, those who cling to honour only when it suits them, and then hang it up like a dirty linen robe at the end of the day. The Brujah were perhaps the worst betrayal for the Salubri, because Brujah himself, or Troil, or depending on your interpretation again, had trained Samael, and yet the philosopher kings that once fought alongside the warrior caste of the Salubri were long gone. These rabble, these new Brujah that had risen in the Dark Ages, were nothing like the honourable Brujah of times gone by. They were hardly recognisable, and so they betrayed the Salubri just as easily as every other clan, and behind the scenes the Barley laughed, because they feel they have manipulated it all. In these final nights, it is said by some that only 7 Salubri remain, constantly 7, that they will only ever embrace another vampire before destroying themselves, or allowing themselves to be diablerized by their child. They will school that child in the ways of the Salubri, in the code of Saulot and of Samael where possible, but all of these 7 are healer Salubri. So what of the warrior Salubri? Well, in recent nights, Salubri have started appearing in the Sabbat, more than 7, and all of relatively high generation in terms of 9th, 10th, 11th, and up. Where have they come from? Where did they suddenly originate from? And where is this dervish-like fervour that they have for destruction of the Tremere come from? it's quite apparent why they have it, but where have they come from and why have they only now decided to align with the Sabbat? They don't care much for their ideals against the antediluvians, but the Tremere and the Camarilla, and that makes the Salubri anti-tribu good bedfellows for the Sabbat, and few knights fight as furiously as Salubri anti-tribu do. And then there's the third caste of the Salubri, who will remain mysterious, I think. So what do you make of this clan, this bloodline, this dilapidated wreck, supposedly Cain's most favoured clan, and yet they couldn't even survive properly through to the final nights? Or could they? Have they? Have they pulled the wool over the eyes of every other vampire? Has Saulot, in fact, been manipulating everything from behind the scenes? Far from being Jesus of the Cainites, perhaps he is Lucifer unbound. He has taken over the Tremere from within, and through doing that, manipulates the Camarilla. Again, all conjecture. The Tremere would have you believe that you can never trust a Salubri, but who would agree that you could ever trust a Tremere? I will leave you on that, and thank you very much for watching.